Boy, there is so much to talk about, Rich. First of all, before I get to the organization Republicans for Harris, as a lifelong Republican that you have been, what do you make of this Mark Robinson story? The fact that he's made all these statements prior to Donald Trump endorsing him, and now North Carolina, the Republican Party there, they're still standing by him. Rich, what do you make of this?
Well, thank you for having me on. Just as is customary, I would like to just offer a very quick mea culpa to all listeners for my complicity in helping Donald Trump divide our country, pitting strangers against each other, tearing asunder communities and families and friendships. I was culpable in that. I helped Donald Trump get elected. I worked very hard to get him elected and reelected, and I was wrong. I acknowledge that mistake, and I would just like to really just make it clear to those who are listening that as hard as I might have worked to get Trump elected, I'm going to work even harder to get Democratic candidates up and down the ballot elected.
I respect that very much, and I appreciate your candor. And that's all we can ask people. Listen, I was wrong in 2016. I didn't vote for Hillary or Trump. So, we're all not perfect. I appreciate the fact that you're on the right side of history now. And I appreciate you admitting that. That's more than I can say for a lot of other Republicans out there. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I think that what's happening in North Carolina is a microcosm of the big macro issue with the Republican Party, which is that I do not believe the Republican Party can be saved. I think it is an irreversibly damaged party. One of the couple of the reasons I left MAGA, it was August 30th, 2022. So I just celebrated what I call my leaving MAGA-versary for 2 years. I did not actually think anyone would care when I wrote my mea culpa. I was wrong about that, thankfully. The Republican Party has deemed acceptable avoidable deaths and suffering. That was a line that I came to. Another line I came to was the defense and justification of politically motivated violence. And I cannot cross those two lines. And so I think what's happening in North Carolina is that the Republican Party, I do believe, knows that it is an organization whose political product is favored by a dwindling number of Americans by the day. And it's why they get stuck with these types of candidates, because the most powerful electoral bloc in the Republican Party are MAGA Americans. They're the ones who determine the candidates who get to the general election. And I think that it's somewhat surprising that listeners may hear what I'm about to say, which is that MAGA Americans and the very devout Trump supporters, as I once was, they are actually not as concerned with electoral outcomes as many may think that they are. So, for example, you could look at other states. You could look at a Carrie Lake. You could look at other Senate candidates. You could see these individuals. Even a Nikki Haley may have been a better general election candidate, but instead it was Donald Trump for the third time, because that's who has actually the power and the influence in the Republican Party, the voting bloc, the Mark Davis's voters. They're the MAGA Americans. And honestly, most people do not. I actually don't think most people care what he may have done in his private time, assuming he wasn't harming anyone. But it does really underscore a lot of the egregious hypocrisy that reflects a complete lack of character among so many of those who are leading the Republican Party right now.
Let's talk about that. And you mentioned Nikki Haley, obviously Ron DeSantis being the governor in your state. What would you say to these Republicans who in the past, at least Nikki Haley, has called him incompetent, unfit, and, among other things, yet they still stand by Donald Trump, knowing who he is, the person that he is, and they still stand by him, I would assume, for two reasons. Number one, he has an R next to his name. And number two, they want to remain in power. And a lot of them feel like and they're probably right, if they denounce Donald Trump and they don't endorse him, they're ostracized from the Republican Party.
I was a Republican under Trump. I supported those candidates. Anyone he endorsed, we supported he or she, even if we didn't like the candidate. If Trump supported and endorsed, we were on board. And I think that what a Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis and so many of these individuals, they stick by Trump because they see him as their one last gasp at being able to hold on to this minoritarian power. I think the Republican Party, many of whom who run the party, are quite intelligent. They understand the landscape of what's happening politically. They know that democratically, lowercase d, their ideas are less and less in favor. So they know that in a competition in the marketplace of ideas, they usually are not on the right side with democracy, because they know that liberalism tends to be more of what the majority of Americans favor, whether it's gun safety, whether it's LGBTQ rights, whether it's whether it's our standing in the world, whether it's trying to bring these issues to the forefront about education. All of these now, the Republican Party theoretically could reverse course on this, but it's really too late.
Yeah,
And so because it's too late,
yeah,
it's a sunk cost fallacy principle, which is
right, right,
Nikki Haley. They're just so deep into it right now that they
right.
really can't reverse on this.
So deep. You're absolutely right about that. If you're just joining us, he is the co-chair Republicans for Harris out of Florida. Rich Logus joining us right now on the show. Rich, what was the final straw for you? Because there's so many things that I can mention, right? The things he said and did when he was president, January 6th, so on and so forth. What was the final straw for you where you said, that's it, I'm done. No matter what the consequences are, I cannot support this despicable man, Donald Trump, anymore. What was the final straw for you?
To paraphrase the late, great Ernest Hemingway, our American author, my personal political epiphany happened gradually and then suddenly all at once. And the catalyst was actually Ron DeSantis. In the summer of 21, kids were getting sick with COVID. They were dying. Children's hospitals were overflowing. He decided to cast doubt on the vaccine. He went off with the Fauciism. He started to change what I thought had been pretty good leadership on the pandemic, certainly compared to Trump. And that was in the summer of 21. So those were the genesis of my doubts. Along the way, I decided to delve deeper into January 6th. And I came to discover that a lot of the groups that I just thought were fringe and hobbyist groups, like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, these were people who actually were well coordinated. And these groups, perhaps worst of all, had the blessing of the most powerful person in the world. So that's all happening in the summer of 21. And then over the course of the next many months, in February of 22, the Republican Party calls the insurrection legitimate political discourse, their words. And for me, the final straw was the Uvalde, Texas school shooting, which happened in May of 22. And all of this combined brought me to those two lines I'd mentioned about the acceptance of avoidable deaths and the defense of politically motivated violence.
Sure.
And privately, it was after Uvalde where I quietly and privately left MAGA. But
I'm
I
glad
decided
you did.
I had to make a decision, though, about whether to stay public or private. And because I was so unapologetically supportive of Trump, I felt that I should be public in my renunciation of the MAGA movement. And that's when I wrote that apology letter, which was on August 30, 2022, because I could not any longer turn off the alarms in my conscience. And when I did it, when I wrote it and published it, I really didn't think anyone would care. And I'm so happy that I was wrong about that, because from the moment it was published, I would receive comments even to this day about people whose friends and family are in the thrall of MAGA. They don't think they're going to have their kinds of relationships anymore with them that they had before 2015 and 16. But I do want to offer a little bit of hope that I think as a result of this Leaving MAGA work we are doing, we are starting to see relationships. Granted, it's slow, albeit it's not as quickly as we'd want, but they're starting to mend. So I couldn't any longer stand by and defend the death and the suffering and the trauma that the Republican Party knew they were causing by supporting Trump, by he and the party amplifying these conspiracy theories that they almost certainly knew were resulting in death and injury. And I looked the other way for a really long time, and I take responsibility for that. I am no one coerced me in supporting Trump or MAGA, but I genuinely believe that the other side was an existential threat. I thought anybody not with us, Democratic or otherwise, they posed a threat and a harm to me, my family, and my livelihood. And Brian, if anybody actually believes that, they will support anyone or anything. And that's where a lot of MAGA Americans find themselves right now. Most in that community, and I call it a community, deep down, most of them are good people. I don't defend the ignorance, just as I don't defend my own ignorance. But I think it would behoove listeners in the nation to remember that all of us are susceptible to being influenced.
So I agree
allowed
with you.
myself to be influenced.
So you sound like a really good guy, and I am not talking about you. But I will say this. Listen, am I going to say the majority? No, I don't know that to be true. But I do think at his rallies, there are a lot of bad people. And what do I mean by that? I've been to his rallies. I see Confederate flags, F Joe and the Ho shirts. I see a lot of hatred and a lot of bigotry. I also agree with you that there are a lot of ignorant people that might not be bad people. I get that. But I see some ignorant people that are bad people. And I go to a Harris rally, and I think we'll agree on this. There is a lot of joy. There is a lot of happiness. I don't see vulgarities on T-shirts. I don't see stuff like that. And I go to these Trump rallies. I just went to one last week. There were a lot of ignorant, hateful people. And that's why I call it a cult. And, you know, we can call it a group. I think it's a cult. And the reason why I say that is because, first of all, you know, the Trump Bibles and the Trump gear and the Trump condoms that I see them selling. And you know, taking a piece of his jacket that he wore when he got his mugshot taken and selling that, the Trump trading cards. I think it's a cult, and I think it's extremely dangerous. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, the ethos of MAGA is one of desperation and panic and these perpetual states of despair, hopelessness, even nihilism, a conviction that if Trump is not victorious, that it will be the end of America. So what you're pointing out there are bad people. There are bad people in any large insular group. And what MAGA and these right-wing mythologies do is they exploit and manipulate people's fears, and those fears that people have about concerns most of us have: economic opportunity, education, safety, and security. That exploitation manifests itself, and those fears are shown by acting out with the vulgarity and siding with the lost cause of the Confederacy, because those individuals, to a large degree, have been failed and led astray. And then they see Trump as this kind of political savior, as a messianic figure to ensure that America that we don't lose our country to liberalism. And that is a real, genuine fear among so many in the MAGA community. I do want to say, though, that I don't believe that most of the politicians and the pundits actually really believe what they say. I don't know what's in their hearts, but I know that they are trying to appeal to the basest among society, because they see it as a way to convince them that this is a last stand for them.
Understood. If you're just joining us again, his name is Rich Logus. He is the co-chair for Republicans for Harris out of Florida. All right, Rich. So I didn't really want to get into a discussion about my issues with Republicans in general.
No, it's okay. Let's do it.
But I appreciate the fact, and let me reiterate this. I'm so appreciative that there are people like you out there, and make no mistake about it. If, in fact, Donald Trump loses in November, there's going to be a lot of reasons for it. One of those reasons is going to be people like you. I think that's going to be a big reason. So I appreciate what you're doing, being on the right side of history, and having I'm trying to come up with the right term, but the honesty is the first word I would use, and a moral compass. Those are the words to come forward and do what you've done. I respect you a great deal. I have a lot of frustrations with Republicans today. Forget about Donald Trump for a moment. And gun control is a big issue, right? And if you speak to a lot of Republicans, not all, they think more guns make us safer. You mentioned Uvalde. And, the night of the Uvalde, Texas shooting, you had Governor Greg Abbott, who refused to leave a campaign event where he was counting money before they even counted all the dead bodies. You have Ted Cruz that day and the day after who said, well, we need to harden our schools, and that back door should have been locked. You have all these Republicans that brag about their A+ ratings from the NRA. That's my issue number one. Issue number two, abortion. So many Republicans out there, not all of them, so many Republicans out there tell me that they think abortion is murder, right? And most of the country disagrees with that. Healthcare. We keep hearing about a replacement plan, and not just Donald Trump, right? But so many Republicans that are so unhappy with Obamacare, but yet Republicans can't come up with a replacement plan. They're against almost every government program that helps poor people get by. It could be maternity leave. It could be food stamps. It could be welfare. You name it, they're against it. I do agree that we have plenty of issues at the border, but then we have, and this ties back to Trump, I guess. We have this border bill put together. It wasn't perfect, but you had MAGA Republicans that sat there and worked with Democrats, vice versa. They came up with the most comprehensive border bill in decades, and Donald Trump picks up the phone and the Republicans give in. So I know I just listed a lot. I could name more, but I want to get your thoughts on any of those if you can.
Well, I think when the Harris campaign asked me to serve in this co-chair role, I accepted without hesitation.
Mhm.
And I do want to note that right now, I'm actually not registered with any party in the state of Florida. I'm what's called
Gotcha.
an NPA. But I was, as I mentioned, a Republican under Trump. I actually thought that both parties were the same before Trump ran for office. And so when he ran as this outsider, no government, no military, a lot of Americans across a broad ideological spectrum, that was enticing to them. And I think that it was a generally anodyne, non-controversial reason to have a curiosity about his campaign, is saying, look, the politicians are failing you. We need to change the ways of Washington. Over time, I thought, yeah, I agree with this. And then I just got all in
Right.
and did volunteer work for his campaign. The Republican Party is everything that you just mentioned there, all of those issues. Okay, they know that our firearm violence is in the developed world unprecedented. Okay, they all know this. If we look at the assassination attempt in Pennsylvania, which when I first heard about it, my first thought was, I truly hope that Donald Trump's okay. Thankfully, he was. But
Mhm.
I'd said to numerous people, I don't care even if the Secret Service had failures that day. Even an event with failed Secret Service is still amongst the safest places in the world. And even in one of the safest places in the world at that moment, it still wasn't immune from firearm violence.
Good point.
So they know that more guns actually does not make people safer. If they
Right.
believed it, then members of Congress would be introducing the Republicans would be introducing bills saying, let's have open AR-15 carry throughout the halls of Congress. And none of them are doing it because they are actually afraid of many of those they're trying to propitiate with this Molon Levey and the Gadsden flag waving. And those individuals are a minority of the minority of gun owners in the United States. And just as a side note, I own a firearm. I'm a believer in responsible concealed carry. I'm a responsible in possession and ownership. But our laws federally, even with the gains that President Biden made, are still probably 40 to 50 years lagging. And if the framers were alive today and they looked around America and said, you know what, the firearm laws are perfect, don't touch them, then the framers were not the erudite, august, sagacious men they have
Right.
been mythologized into. And just to be clear, I don't think that they would say that right now.
Yeah.
I think they'd be wondering and saying, I don't think you guys quite understood what we were trying exactly to do here.
Yeah.
And that's just one issue. And guns are an important issue because of
Sure.
just the sheer number of
Yeah.
violence and death amongst all age
We
groups.
are
And the
we are not
Republican
well
Party knows it.
regulated. We are not well
Not
regulated right now.
no,
And
no.
I could not agree with what you said more. Totally in agreement with you. And so right now, I'm curious to ask you. I'm sure you've had plenty of discussions till to this day with staunch Donald Trump supporters in Florida. How do those conversations go? And what is their reasoning that they are so stubborn that forget about even voting for Harris, which you are, which I appreciate. But even if they're not going to vote, which I would still respect, they're still going to vote for Donald Trump. How do those conversations go?
It comes back to, I believe, the community aspect that I mentioned when we're just so invested in a group of like-minded individuals. You know, there was no community that the Bushes or Mitt Romney or a late John McCain created. And one of the reasons it was so hard for me to walk away, and it took me an entire year to leave MAGA, is because you are walking away from that second family. And my second family, as much as I'm embarrassed to admit this, took precedence often over my own blood family. And in that community, Donald Trump is the leader of that community. So the allegiance to the community is really inextricably linked to the devotion to Donald Trump as this person who is their champion, is the one who is going to save America, is the one who's going to stop the spread of liberalism and the erosion of our values and our culture. He's the one who has developed that community. And the adherence comes back to that there is a belief that it is in zero sum, all or none. If Trump is not victorious and we don't win in this last stand, that we're
Right.
going to lose America. And so that there's a very famous meme, viewers and listeners may remember this. It's Donald Trump sitting down, he's got his hand in a firearm formation, and it says, it's not It's not me they're after. They're after you. I'm just in the way.
Mm.
And that way, that there's a unity that happens of banding together to fight this common enemy of those who are anti-American and against us. And so there is this traumatic mythology that exists. It's pervasive across MAGA that everyone and everything, industries and politicians and the media and you name it, are all colluding against us because we are Trump voters. And Trump gives voice to that. And over time, the longer one is in that community, the more one adopts that way of thinking. But the good news is this, and I hope that my story is instructional in that people can leave. And so those conversations with Trump supporters at our site, leavingmaga.org, I have a free ebook. We do not charge for our content. In that ebook is a blueprint on how friends and family can actually speak to those friends and families they have who are in MAGA. One of the mistakes that well-meaning people make who are against Trump and against MAGA is they always lead conversations with facts. That is not how we reach people. If you go to the doctor and you've got a deathly illness of some kind, the doctor doesn't sit there and first explain the physiological aspect of it. The doctor sits you down and says, look, you keep doing this, you're going to die. He doesn't get into the medicine of it. That's what happens with a lot of well-meaning people talking to Trump voters, trying to start with facts or policies. It doesn't work. If it worked, no one would be in MAGA.
Yeah.
You know, no one would. And if a lot of the rhetoric about Trump voters, whether we're talking about calling all of them Nazis, and I'm not saying you did that, calling them all Nazis and Islamophobes, transphobic, etc. If that worked, there are probably billions of words that have been penned and spoken like that. If that worked to get people leave, they wouldn't.
That's not going to work.
Already.
Yeah, that's definitely not going to work. Listen, I have friends of mine that are Trump supporters. I wouldn't say they're Klan cultists. I think some of them are. In no way, shape, or form do I ever generalize in saying all Trump supporters are this or that. But at the same time, I think his base of supporters are not the brightest bulbs in the world. But I'll say this in closing again, and I hope people check out that ebook, by the way, because I think that's very valuable information. And if you send me a little bit more information, I'll gladly put it on my social media platform. But I'll say it again, Rich, you know, if Trump loses in November, which we both hope he does, it's going to be because of people like you. It's going to be because of Republicans with a moral compass. It's going to be because of Republicans that have the courage to come forward and say, listen, I can't vote for this guy and I'm a Republican or whatever you are, but I'm going to support Harris because it's either going to be one of the two and I care about our democracy. So, Rich, I really appreciate you coming on this show. I have good people like you who reach out to me on social media every day. Moderate Republicans. Brian, I'm with you. I've been a lifelong Republican my whole life. I can't support this man anymore, and I'm glad what you do. And you were one of those people, and I'll always give people like you a platform to come on here and tell your story, Rich. So thank you so much for doing so. You're welcome back anytime, and I hope people buy that ebook. It's very valuable, and it's great work you're doing out there in Florida. Please keep up the good work, okay, my friend?
Thank you so much for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rich. Pleasure to have you, my friend. That's Rich Logus. He's the co-chair of Republicans for Harris out of Florida. Good guy, nice man. He's doing good work out there. And listen, I can sit here and say, well, wait a second. Why did you vote for him in 2016? Wait a second. Rich, why did you vote for him in 2020 after he did this, this, and this? I'm not going to go down that path. The most important part of this conversation is he's on the right side now, and he's actually helping Harris. And he's working with her campaign. I think that's wonderful.